Sarah drove a wooden stake into the finished compost pile and wrote 2 words across it in black marker. Do not sell. The pile looked fine, dark, crumbly, earthy. Weeks of turning, hauling, and processing had gone into it, and nothing about the material looked obviously wrong. But 30 yards away, Sarah was staring at a small test bed where several young plants had begun to struggle. Uneven growth, stressed leaves, no clear explanation. The strange part was that the compost beside her had come from exactly the kind of opportunity she had once searched for. Old hay somebody wanted gone for almost nothing. And now Sarah was refusing to let a single shovel of it leave the farm. She didn't know whether the problem was the hay. She didn't know whether it was the weather. She didn't even know whether the compost was responsible. But she knew something else. If she guessed wrong, the mistake would stay in her field. It would go home with her customers. Sarah looked across the pile, representing weeks of labor and money. The easiest decision was to sell it. Instead, she grabbed her notebook, crossed out the entire batch, and walked toward the remaining loads of nearly free hay. Then she began separating every one of them, because somewhere inside material that looked completely ordinary, Sarah suspected there was a problem she still couldn't see. The first truck arrived just after sunrise. Its tires ground across the gravel as the driver backed toward the far edge of Sarah Miller's farm, carrying something no farmer in the county seemed to want anymore. 30 tons of rain-damaged hay. The bales leaned against one another like collapsing walls. Twine hung loose. Dark stains spread through the outer layers, and wet strands dragged from the trailer in heavy ropes. Sarah stood beside the unloading area with her boots planted in the mud. The driver climbed down and stared at her. You Sarah Miller? Yes. And you actually bought all of this? Sarah looked at the trailer. All of it. For $600? She nodded. The driver gave a short laugh. You know this stuff used to be worth thousands. Sarah knew. That was before rain found its way through a leaking barn roof and soaked deep into the stacked bales. Once the owner discovered moisture inside, more than just the outer layers. He stopped treating the hay like inventory. He treated it like a problem. Sarah walked toward the first bale as it dropped from the trailer. Good hay should have smelled dry and sweet. This didn't. The odor was damp, sour, and strangely earthy. She pulled apart a dark section near the center. The fibers were soft, some broke apart between her fingers with almost no effort. The driver watched her. I wouldn't have put that anywhere near livestock. I'm not going to, he frowned. Then what are you doing with 30 tons of it? Sarah looked toward the fields behind her. She didn't have a good answer. Not yet. What she had was exhausted soil that hardened every summer, irrigation costs she could barely justify, and several quotes for bulk compost she couldn't afford. And now she had 30 tons of plant material everyone else had decided was worthless. The final bale hit the ground. The driver climbed back into his cab, then rolled down the window. I still think you paid $600 for garbage. Sarah looked across the enormous pile. For a moment she wondered the same thing, because she had no formula, no specialized equipment, no customers, no finished product, and no proof that any of this would work. She had simply noticed something other people hadn't. The hay was ruined for the job it had been grown to do. But it had not disappeared. The plant fiber was still there. The organic matter was still there. 30 tons of material was sitting in front of her. Sarah grabbed a pitchfork and tore open the nearest bale. Deep inside, the material was darker than she expected. Warm too, she pulled her hand back. Something was already happening inside the pile. She just didn't understand what, and before those 30 tons became useful. Sarah was about to make a mistake that nearly convinced her the truck driver had been right. 3 years before the truck arrived, Sarah Miller had already learned one expensive lesson about farming. Bad soil made every other problem worse. From the road, her small farm looked healthy enough. Spring rain turned the fields green. Young vegetables filled neat rows by early summer. A visitor might have assumed the land was doing exactly what farmland was supposed to do. Sarah knew better. By July, the top few inches of soil could harden into a stubborn crust. Water hit the surface and sometimes ran sideways instead of sinking evenly. Beds that looked healthy in May became stressed under weeks of dry weather. Sarah compensated the only way she knew how. More irrigation, more time moving hoses and lines, more pumping, more money. One afternoon, she sat at a small table with 3 quotes for bulk compost spread in front of her. She calculated the cost again then. Again, the number did not improve. She could afford enough compost to help a few beds. She could not afford enough to change the farm. Sarah closed the notebook and looked through the window toward the field. She had been asking one question for months. How much good soil could she afford to buy? That afternoon, she finally realized it might be the wrong question. Finished compost arrived after somebody else had already gathered the raw materials, managed decomposition, screened the result, loaded it, transported it, and added a margin. Sarah was paying for every step. What happened if she moved backward in the process? She opened the notebook again. On a blank page, she wrote, "What is compost made from?" The answers were ordinary plant material, manure, old bedding, leaves, crop residues, materials farms produced every day. That led to another question. What happened to those materials when nobody wanted them? Sarah began paying attention. A horse stable had mountains of used bedding. Neighbors hauled plant residue away after harvest. Feed sometimes spoiled. Hay got wet. Organic material moved constantly through rural communities, but once it stopped performing its original job, people often saw only the cost of removing it. Sarah began keeping a second list beside her normal farm expenses, not products she wanted to buy. Waste streams she wanted to understand. She called neighbors. She talked to stable owners. She asked growers what they discarded. Most conversations went nowhere. Then one morning, a farmer several miles away mentioned a storage barn. Part of his hay supply had been soaked after a roof leak. He could no longer sell it the way he intended. Sarah picked up her pen. How much? About 30 tons. Sarah stopped writing. 30 tons. Water damaged. Needs it gone. For months, she had been wondering how much good soil cost. Now she began wondering something completely different. What could bad hay become? The barn smelled wrong before Sarah even stepped fully inside. Good hay had a dry sweetness. This smelled heavier, damp, earthy, almost fermented in places. The owner pulled open the sliding door and pointed toward the back wall. That's it, Sarah stopped. The stack was larger than she expected. Bales stood 3 and 4 high. Some remained square and tight, while others sagged at the corners. Blackened stains spread through patches of the outer layers. Loose strands covered the floor. What happened? Roof leak. The farmer pointed toward a repaired section of metal overhead. Storm came through. I thought I caught it early. Water had traveled farther into the stack than expected. When he opened several bales, he found moisture deep inside. Some sections had discolored. Others had softened. The hay might still physically resemble feed, but he no longer trusted it for livestock. I've got buyers for good hay, he said. Nobody wants this. Sarah walked toward a damaged bale and pulled away a handful. The outside strands were faded and coarse. The middle felt different. Darker, softer, beginning to break apart. I would have feed that to anything, the farmer said. I'm not planning to. He stared at her. Sarah crouched and rubbed the fibers between her fingers. She was not a compost expert. She barely knew enough to realize how much she didn't know, but the material had not vanished. Just because the market price had collapsed, there was still plant fiber, still organic matter, still mass, 30 tons of it. What are you going to do with all this? Sarah asked. The farmer laughed. That's the problem. The bales occupied valuable storage space. Moving them would take equipment and labor. Disposing of them would cost time. Sarah suddenly understood the negotiation differently. She was trying to buy something valuable. She was offering to remove someone else's headache. How much for everything, the whole pile? All of it. He named a price. Sarah shook her head. They went back and forth eventually. They agreed on $600 if Sarah handled transportation, $20 a ton. Sarah wrote the number in her notebook, then added another line beneath it. What is this worth after decomposition? The farmer looked over her shoulder. You really think there's something in that? Sarah closed the notebook. I don't know, that was the truth. She was buying a proven product. She was buying a question, and $600 was now the price of finding out whether she had seen value where everyone else saw rot. Sarah's first experiment was simple. Too simple, she took the damaged hay and spread a thick layer across one of the weakest garden plots on her farm. The logic seemed obvious. The soil needed organic matter. The hay was organic matter. Problem solved. For several days, it looked like she had been right. The layer shaded the surface. The ground underneath remained moist longer. The afternoon sun no longer baked the exposed soil into a hard crust. Sarah began imagining how much money she might save. Then the smell changed. She noticed it first near the center of the bed, sour heavy, when she pushed her hand beneath the hay. The lower layer felt wet and compacted. The fibers had settled into a dense mat. Almost no air moved through it. A second pile she had stacked near the barn was worse. Its outer layer dried in the sun while the center stayed soaked. Sarah pushed a fork deep into it. Some areas were warm, others were cold and slimy. Nothing was breaking down evenly. She pulled the pile apart and stood staring at the mess. This was not the dark, crumbly material she had imagined. It was simply rotting. For the first time, Sarah understood there was a difference. Decomposition happened automatically. Useful compost did not. She had assumed organic matter eventually became something beneficial if she waited long enough. But biology responded to conditions. Too wet and the pile lost air. Too compacted and it turned sour. Too dry and decomposition slowed. The hay was not a finished solution. It was only one ingredient. That realization sent Sarah looking for people who understood the process better than she did. She called a local grower who had composted manure for years. How wet should it be? How often do you turn it? What causes the smell? How do you know when something is going wrong? Her questions filled an entire notebook page. The answers changed how she looked at the 30 tons behind her barn. She had been treating the hay like cheap compost. It was tea. It was carbon-rich material entering a biological system she did not yet know how to control. Sarah wrote one sentence at the top of a new page. Decomposition is automatic. Good compost is designed. Then she walked back outside and began tearing her failed pile apart. The first experiment had not given her better soil, but it had given her something she needed first, a reason to stop guessing. Sarah rebuilt the pile differently. This time she did not start by asking how much rotten hay she could fit into it. She started by asking what the hay was missing. The answer changed everything. The damaged bales gave her plenty of fibrous, carbon-rich plant material. But carbon alone was not a complete compost system. The grower she had called explained it without making it complicated. Think of the hay as one side of the recipe, he told her. You still have to build the other side. Sarah needed nitrogen-rich material. She needed enough moisture for microbial activity. She needed air. Most importantly, she needed to stop allowing the wet fibers to collapse into dense, oxygen-poor mats. So she began sourcing small amounts of material nearby, fresh manure from a stable, green crop residue from her own farm, other suitable organic material when she could identify where it came from. Then she rebuilt, instead of dropping whole wet clumps into one heap. Sarah loosened the hay with a fork. She mixed the materials, she added water. Only when a section felt too dry. She stopped when the pile felt damp rather than soaked. The work was slow. Fork, mix, check, water, mix again. At sunset, the new pile looked less impressive than the original mountain of hay, but Sarah trusted it more. She had made choices she could explain. Over the next several days, she watched. She resisted the urge to keep changing things. Then she pushed a long compost thermometer into the center. The needle moved. Sarah leaned closer. It kept climbing. The next morning, she checked again. The pile was warmer, not because the hay was mysteriously turning into soil. Microorganisms were consuming and transforming the material under conditions Sarah had deliberately created. For the first time, she could connect an action with a result. She began recording everything: source of hay, approximate amount, manure, green material, moisture, turning, temperature. One batch dried too quickly, she changed it. Another became too wet after rain, she opened it and restored airflow. A third developed the sour smell she now recognized immediately. Instead of hoping it would fix itself, Sarah dismantled the problem section. Weeks earlier, every pile had looked the same to her. Now she saw differences: texture, compaction, moisture, smell. Sarah had originally believed the opportunity was the cheap hay. She was beginning to realize something else. Anyone could buy damaged hay. The real value was learning what to do with it after it arrived. And that knowledge was becoming far more valuable than the $600 she had spent. Several mornings, after Sarah recorded the first temperature rise, she crossed the yard and noticed something new. A thin ribbon of vapor drifted from the compost pile into the cool air. She stopped beside it. This time she did not panic. She already understood that the center was heating. The vapor simply made the invisible activity visible. Sarah pushed the thermometer into 3 different locations. One section was hot, another was cooler. The edges had barely warmed. Months earlier, she might have celebrated the highest number and walked away. Now she saw information. The pile was not heating evenly. Sarah pulled material from the cooler outside edge toward the center and moved hotter material outward. Then she checked the moisture. One area crumbled too easily, too dry. She added water. Another felt heavy. She opened it with the fork. Over the following weeks, Sarah repeated the routine until the actions became less like experimentation and more like production. Measure, adjust, record, wait, turn, measure again, and gradually, the ingredients lost their separate identities. Long strands of hay became shorter. Manure disappeared into the mixture. Green plant material became impossible to identify. The pile darkened. Its texture changed. The sour smell was replaced by something closer to forest soil. Sarah picked up a handful. Dark, loose, crumbly. This was the result she had been trying to create. But one good pile was not enough. A lucky batch did not make a business, so Sarah built another. Then another. She used her notes instead of memory. When something changed, she recorded it. When something failed, she tried to understand why before changing the next batch. Eventually, she opened a fresh notebook page and wrote 3 headings: input, process, output. Under input, she listed the materials and their sources. Under process, she recorded moisture, temperature, turning, and time. Under output, she described the finished material: texture, smell, consistency. That simple page changed how she thought. She was no longer asking whether rotten hay could become compost. She had already answered that. The new question was harder. Could she make a similar result again, then again, then again? Because if every batch behaved completely differently, Sarah had an interesting farm experiment. If she could repeat the transformation reliably, she had something else, a process, and a process could eventually be used for much more than fixing her own soil. Sarah refused to trust the compost, simply because it looked right. She wanted evidence, so she chose one of the weakest sections of the farm and divided it into 3 small plots. The first received nothing, the control. The second received a measured amount of finished compost incorporated lightly into the topsoil. The third received the same compost plus a thin mulch layer. Then Sarah planted the same crop, same seed, same day, same irrigation schedule for nearly 2 weeks. Nothing interesting happened. The rows emerged together, from a distance. The plots looked almost identical. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped beside the field. Sarah explained the test. He looked at the 3 beds. Looks like dirt to me. Sarah smiled. Right now it does. Then the weather turned dry. Days passed without meaningful rain. By afternoon, Sarah noticed the untreated plot showing stress first. Its surface hardened faster. Water disappeared from the upper layer more quickly. The compost-amended soil remained easier to work. Under the mulch, Sarah could still feel moisture after the exposed control plot had dried. The results were not miraculous. Nothing doubled in size overnight. Sarah didn't need them to. She cared about repeatable differences. She measured how often the plots needed irrigation. She pushed a hand trowel into the ground and compared resistance. She watched crust formation. She pulled several plants and examined the root zone. Then she repeated the test somewhere else. Again and again, Sarah adjusted the amount of compost. Too little produced almost no noticeable change. Too much wasted material. Slowly, she learned not only how to make the compost, but how customers might eventually use it. One afternoon, a local market gardener named Tom stopped to pick up vegetable crates. He walked past one of Sarah's amended beds, then turned around. The darker surface caught his attention. "What did you put in there?" "Compost." He crouched from that wet hay. "Some of it." Tom ran the soil through his fingers. Then he looked toward the piles behind Sarah's barn. "You selling any?" Sarah laughed. "No." Tom stood. "You should." He drove away with his crates. Sarah stayed beside the bed. Until that moment, the compost had been a way to reduce her own farm costs. But Tom had noticed the difference without Sarah trying to sell him anything. That evening, she opened her notebook. Under the test results, she wrote one question: what would someone pay for a result they could actually see? 4 days later, Tom returned. This time, there was an empty trailer behind his truck. Tom stepped out of the truck and pointed toward Sarah's finished pile. "How much can you spare?" Sarah looked at the trailer. "You were serious? I've got 2 raised beds that turn into dust by August. I'm willing to try it." Sarah had no price list. No bags, no brand. She had never decided whether the compost was a product. So she improvised. They loaded several containers. Sarah estimated the amount and charged enough to cover handling and part of her material cost. The transaction was small, barely worth calling a sale. Sarah wrote it in her notebook anyway, not because of the money, because someone had just paid for material that had begun as rejected hay. 2 weeks later, Tom came back. Sarah expected him to tell her whether it worked. Instead, he asked, "Can you make something I can plant directly into?" Sarah frowned. "You mean more compost?" "No, a mix," Tom explained. The compost was useful, but using it still required decisions. How much, mixed with what? For which crop? What ratio? He wanted something simpler. Something he could put directly into a raised bed without building the mixture himself. Sarah realized Tom was not really asking for more material. He was asking for less uncertainty. She went back to experimenting. Different proportions, different textures, different uses. One mix held too much water. Another dried too quickly. One compacted badly. Sarah rejected batches she did not trust. Tom became her unofficial test customer. He returned with observations: too heavy, good for tomatoes, too loose, not suitable for seedlings. Sarah wrote every comment down. Eventually, her notebook gained a section that had never existed before. Customer use, that changed the direction of the business. Sarah had started by asking, "What can rotten hay become?" The answer was compost. But Tom had forced a more valuable question: what does the customer need the finished material to do? A person improving existing soil did not need the same product as someone filling a new raised bed. A grower trying to increase organic matter needed something different from a homeowner looking for a ready-to-use planting mix. The compost was becoming an ingredient instead of the destination. Sarah could feel her thinking change. She was no longer only a farmer trying to make a cheaper input. She was beginning to design products around problems. And once she understood that distinction, one pile of homemade compost was about to turn into several different products. At first, Sarah kept the different mixes in separate piles, marked with pieces of scrap wood. Raised bed, amendment, compost. Nothing about the setup looked like a company, but customers began treating the piles differently. One Saturday morning, Sarah was helping a gardener load compost when another truck pulled into the yard. The driver stepped out and looked around. "I need whatever you gave Tom for his raised beds." Sarah paused. He wasn't asking for compost. He was asking for a specific result that mattered. She walked him toward the newer blend. "This one? If that's the one." A week later, another customer asked for the same thing. Sarah realized word was spreading, but it created a new problem. Customers expected the second load to behave like the first. That sounds obvious. For Sarah, it changed production completely. Until then, she could adjust each batch by feel. A little more of this, a little less of that, but if people returned because a product had worked for them, improvisation became dangerous. Sarah pulled out her notebook. She began standardizing what she could. Approximate ratios, input sources, moisture, processing time, screening, final texture. Instead of making whatever mixture seemed reasonable that day, she tried to reproduce the batches customers had liked. One afternoon, she screened a load differently and noticed the texture was much finer than the previous batch. Months earlier, she might have sold it anyway. Instead, she stopped. She compared the material with her notes, then she moved it to a separate area. Consistency was becoming more important than maximizing every pile. Sarah added simple signs, then printed instructions. One blend for improving tired garden soil, another for filling raised beds, another compost-rich amendment for customers working with existing ground. Something surprising happened. The more specific the products became, the less often customers asked whether Sarah's material was cheaper than ordinary dirt. They asked different questions. Which one should I use? How much do I need? Which one is better for this bed? Can I get the same blend again next month? Sarah noticed the shift. Raw compost was a material. A defined blend carried something additional. Information, convenience, confidence. Sarah was not charging customers for a pile of decomposed plants alone. She was reducing the number of decisions they had to make after buying it. By late summer, the yard behind the barn had changed. Separate piles, separate labels, different customers arriving for different products, and Sarah finally understood the chain she had accidentally started building. Rejected material, controlled process, consistent product, specific use. That final step mattered most, because Sarah was no longer selling what rotten hay had become. She was selling what people could reliably do with it. Success created a dangerous temptation. Sarah began seeing opportunity in almost every discarded organic material she encountered. Old hay, stable bedding, manure, crop residue. If somebody wanted something gone, Sarah wanted to know whether she could use it. Cheap inputs had helped her get started. For a while, she began believing cheap was automatically good. Then a local property owner called. "I've got several loads of old hay, almost free if you haul it." A year earlier, Sarah would have accepted immediately. This time, she at least looked at the material first. It seemed ordinary, weathered, dry enough, fibrous. Nothing about it raised an obvious alarm. Sarah agreed to take it. Part of the hay went into a production batch. Weeks later, the finished material looked normal, dark, processed, no strange odor. Sarah might have sold it without thinking twice. Instead, she tested a small amount. That decision saved her from a much larger problem. The plants in one trial area did not behave the way she expected. Growth was uneven. Several sensitive plants showed stress. Sarah stood at the edge of the test bed with her notebook open. She did not know why. That uncertainty was enough. She isolated the entire batch. Nothing would leave the farm. The decision hurt. The material represented transportation, labor, processing, equipment time, weeks of work. Sarah could have convinced herself that the plants were suffering from heat, or seed, or irrigation. Any explanation would have allowed her to sell the pile and recover the cost. She refused. She had learned something more valuable than the batch. Once customers trusted her products, one questionable load could cost far more than the material itself. Sarah changed her intake process. Where did the hay come from? How had the field been managed? Was the material mixed with anything? How long had it been stored? Could the source be identified? She started keeping suppliers separate until she understood their inputs. Unknown material entered small tests first. Some suppliers found the questions annoying. Sarah accepted that. She was no longer the woman willing to haul away anything organic. She was producing something customers expected to behave consistently, and production required control. Sarah wrote a sentence above her workbench: "Know the input before you promise the output." The lesson slowed her down. It also changed what kind of company she was building. Her advantage was no longer finding the cheapest waste. It was knowing which discarded materials were actually worth accepting. Once Sarah became more selective, she noticed a contradiction. Rejecting bad inputs made sourcing harder, but it also made growth possible. Random loads could support experiments. They could not support a reliable business. If customers expected the same products repeatedly, Sarah needed dependable materials repeatedly. so she stopped waiting for opportunities to arrive. She went looking for relationships. At a horse stable, she stood beside a growing pile of used bedding while the owner explained how often it had to be moved. "How much of this do you generate?" "Every week." "Same bedding?" Usually Sarah wrote it down. At another farm, she asked about spoiled hay. At a landscaping operation, she asked where clean plant material went. At nearby growers, she learned which residues appeared during specific parts of the season. But now every conversation included questions she had not asked in the beginning. Can the material be traced? Is it consistent? Is anything mixed with it? Will it be available again? Sarah began mapping sources in her notebook. One stable produced bedding steadily. A nearby farmer periodically had unsaleable hay. Another operation generated plant residue during predictable harvest periods. For the first time, Sarah could see a network instead of a series of lucky discoveries. She scheduled pickups, created separate storage zones, tracked suppliers, rejected loads before they entered production, and gradually, the calls changed. At the beginning, Sarah had called people asking for unwanted materials. Now some of those people called Sarah. "We've got another load ready. Can you pick up Friday? How much can you take this month?" Sarah was solving a problem for them too. Unwanted organic material required handling. Fuel, equipment, labor, space. When a suitable byproduct could move directly into Sarah's controlled process, both sides gained. That did not mean the inputs were free. Sarah had learned better than that. Every material carried costs. Pickup, transportation, storage, processing, testing, rejecting bad loads. The purchase price was only one number. The entire chain determined whether an input actually made economic sense. That understanding made the operation harder to copy. A competitor could buy a compost thermometer. A competitor could acquire a loader or build piles. But Sarah had begun building something less visible. Supplier relationships, intake standards, batch records, production experience, customers who returned for specific blends. Behind the barn, the operation no longer looked like one desperate farmer experimenting with spoiled hay. Materials arrived in designated areas. Finished products stayed separate. Orders went out. Equipment moved through the yard more often. The pile had become a system, and systems could grow beyond the limits of one lucky 30-ton purchase. For a long time, Sarah believed she was building a compost business. Then she thought she was building a soil blending business. Eventually, she realized both descriptions were too small. Customers were not arriving because they were fascinated by decomposition. They had problems. Raised beds that dried too quickly, garden soil that had become difficult to work, new beds that needed filling, existing ground that needed more organic matter. Sarah began changing the first question she asked when someone arrived. Instead of, "How much compost do you need?" she asked, "What are you trying to grow? Is the bed new or existing? Does your soil dry out too fast? Does water sit on the surface? What are you trying to change?" Those conversations transformed the sale. A homeowner filling a new raised bed did not need the same thing as a market gardener, improving an existing field. Sarah stopped trying to sell everyone the same pile. She matched products to uses. Then she made the instructions clearer. How much to apply, where a blend was intended to be used, when to incorporate it, when to leave it at the surface, what customers should expect, and equally important, what they should not expect. Sarah refused to promise miracles. Soil changed over time. Organic matter helped as part of a larger system involving roots, water, biology, and management. That honesty did something exaggerated marketing could not. It created repeat customers. A gardener who tested one load returned later. Small growers came back for larger quantities after trying the material themselves. Customers started asking for blends they had previously purchased, instead of simply asking for the cheapest dirt available. As demand grew, the physical operation changed with it. Sarah improved screening, added more permanent storage areas, upgraded equipment, replaced handwritten labels with packaging and instructions that looked like products rather than farm leftovers. But the largest transformation remained invisible. Sarah had learned where value actually entered the chain. Raw material created cost, controlled processing created usefulness, consistency created trust, solving a specific customer problem created value. Years after that first truck backed into her farm, Sarah eventually looked at what the operation had produced financially. Across the life of the growing business, cumulative sales had climbed to roughly $1.4 million, not profit. And not because 30 tons of spoiled hay somehow transformed directly into $1.4 million worth of soil. That was never the real story. The original 30 tons had done something more important. They forced Sarah to learn a repeatable pattern. Something could become worthless for one purpose without becoming worthless entirely. The hay lost its value as livestock feed. Sarah learned how to transform suitable discarded materials through a controlled process. Then she learned to make the output consistent. Then she learned what customers actually wanted that output to do. The $600 had not bought Sarah a $1 million pile of hay. It had bought her the first 30 tons of a lesson. Years later, trucks still moved through the same farmyard. But now some arrived carrying approved raw materials. Others left carrying finished soil products customers had specifically requested. Sarah could still remember the first driver, looking across the rotten bales and shaking his head. "I still think you paid $600 for garbage." At the time, Sarah had not been certain he was wrong. Now she understood the answer. Garbage was not always a type of material. Sometimes it was simply the name people gave something after they stopped knowing what to do with it.